All right, welcome everyone to today's lecture where we'll be talking about a very commonly known or well-known teaching strategy called differentiation. Now, differentiation is something of a buzzword at the moment. You probably will have seen it. There's a lot of people doing PDs and seminars and webinars, and you see this particular term all over the place. It mainly applies to working with students with disabilities or with some type of additional need. Now, that additional need can simply mean that the student is falling behind and they need some type of remedial or intervention action to support them through to the next stage of their education to help them catch up to the rest of the class, depending on again, whether they have a special need, whether it's a short-term issue or a difficulty, and so forth. So one of the problems with differentiation that I've seen so far is that very few of the experts have been able to define differentiation or been willing to explain differentiation in terms of what it actually means for teachers who teach 33 students in a lesson for 60 minutes or so times 5 or 6 hours in a day. How do you go about using teaching strategies in those types of circumstances? Because differentiation is pretty straightforward and easy to apply when you're working with special needs students. First, you have to take into account the disability and the needs of that student, obviously. You have to consider the resources and the goals and so on and so forth. But it normally is, I wouldn't say obvious, but relatively simple in terms of you have one student and you're trying to meet the educational goals of that student. Now, that's not to say that that's not a difficult task, but I think that's a little bit easier than when you're trying to work out how to apply these strategies under the extreme time pressures of, say, your average middle school student, teacher or teacher aide who is working with large volumes of students. Now, if you're doing differentiation with special needs kids inside who are integrated in a general classroom, so say a year 6 class and it has a student with autism in that class, then obviously you're already doing differentiation. I'd be very surprised if you're not. And quite often you'll have the main classroom teacher and a support worker of some description. The support worker's job is quite often to differentiate the curriculum. So there's various different ways we can go about the process of differentiating the way in which we deliver education. One of them is in the planning, one of them is in resources, one of them is in the teaching strategies that we use, one of them is in the pace and the momentum. And we'll probably go through these later, time depending. So it's usually the classroom teacher's job to plan for those things and to make those minor adjustments as they're going through the planning phase. One of the most common ways to do that, as I was saying, is to simply chunk down activities into smaller parts, to put more scaffolds around those particular activities, and to use different types of teaching strategies, particularly that one-on-one instruction, which also I've got videos about. So all of these different strategies that are used for differentiation, I've got separate videos about, because by and large differentiation is simply, as a definition I guess you could say, it's simply conducting the education process in a slightly different way based on the individual needs of a student. So instead of just teaching to the masses, you're teaching or making tweaks on that main way of delivering education. You're making some tweaks specifically to the needs of that particular student. So that's differentiation in a nutshell. A relatively simple sort of concept to understand, broadly speaking. If you're working in education, you're probably already doing this, even if you've never heard of that term. And it's been around forever. The one other thing I always say is ignore the fact that this is quite a big word and that it may sound a bit academic or technical. All of these teaching strategies are very simple at the core. At their core, they are very simple. And I'd just like to always remind people of that. Even the more advanced, inverted commas, advanced teaching strategies that I talk about either in my books or in here, in these videos, at the very core of it, they're all very, very simple, and you can divide them up into sort of sub-strategies as well to make it even easier. But don't let any of these strategies confuse you. They are Very simple. It just means making changes for an individual student in various different ways. And of course, there is best practice ways about doing that. You can do it in lots of different ways. Anyway, so doing that with special needs students is relatively simple. You're probably already doing it. If you're just starting off your career, you will see teachers and teacher aides doing that to death anyway. A lot of teacher aides in, say, a special needs centre, a special needs school, will spend a portion of their time developing resources specifically for one or more students, based on their individual needs. So if they're hearing impaired or whatnot, then there will be adjustments made to the teaching resources and the curriculum and the strategies and so on and so forth. So one way to think of that is go watch one of my planning videos, whether it's the lesson planning one or the one just about planning courses and units of work and so forth. And as you go through that, just think how you would make adjustments to that for a student with a learning disorder, say someone with a low IQ under 70 or something like that, or for a student who had some type of neurological issue or disorder or disability, or a physical disorder or disability. That's differentiation. There's lots of different ways that you can go about differentiating the curriculum and differentiating the lesson or activity. Sometimes you do it on the fly, which means let's say you're a teacher or the teacher, and the student will come in and everyone will start on the same lesson, but these one individual student you will make minor adjustments to there and then. On the other hand, it may also be planned. So I just want to do a quick little graphic here just to explain how differentiation might work if you're teaching large groups of students. Because as I said, doing that with an individual student is relatively easy. There are lots of different ways you can do it, but relatively easy and straightforward, particularly if you know that student really well. When you're teaching large groups of students, or even if you're a support worker working with large groups of students, that's where it becomes not tricky, but it takes a little bit more thought to be able to implement that in a best practice way to maximise learning outcomes and to ensure that you're working at the highest possible level. Okay, so you might have heard of, actually I won't tell you what this is, maybe you'll figure it out as we go. Now let's call this level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. I'm going to do level 6 as level 6. I did the same thing twice. Level 6. Okay, so let's assume that in a particular class there are 6 levels of ability in a particular topic. Let's say science. All right? So these are science levels. And as with a lot of my videos, I'm just making this up as I go, but you get the idea. So this student here really struggles, isn't at school very often maybe, maybe has a disability or something like that that makes it difficult for them to learn for whatever reason. Level 2, level 3 and 4 is kind of mid-range. So these are the students that will get maybe a C or something like that. They'll pass, but they're not high flyers. Some might be more motivated than others. Level 6 out of a class of 30 is your, the 5%, your 1 or 2 students who are high flyers, who are gifted and talented, or who are just very motivated in that particular topic. Obviously, this is very general, but there is a lot of research that shows that if students are good in one topic, then they are therefore better in other related topics. So those good at science are probably going to be relatively good at maths, and those good at maths and science are, despite what you might think as far as that stereotype of science and maths people, generally if students are good in one or more topic, they're also going to be quite good in other topics. There's been a lot of research over the years trying to draw those links. There is a particular strong link between say reading and writing, whereas if students become really good at reading and they love reading, then they become exceptionally good at writing just by the nature of engaging with words and sentences and books and things like that. So there are those links. But anyway, that's by the by. So the point is that could be pretty much any topic. It's going to almost be the same for most topics for most students. Slight changes, but that student at level 5 or 6 is not going to be level 1 or 2 at English in most cases. There might be some rare examples where that is the case, but generally speaking, that's not how it works in the real world. So now down the side here, we're just going to have just pure numbers. the number of students. So I'm just going to use number of students, and let's just go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 14. There is a point to this. 16. Now, might not work out at 32, but I think you'll get the idea. Now, at level 1, we're going to have, we'll use a different colour. At level 1, as in the students that are really struggling, let's say we do have 2 students. And conversely, at level 6, let's say 2 students. Okay. Now, in most classes, we'll have a few students at level 2. Let's say there's 4. And then at level 5, let's say there's 4 as well. Typically speaking, of course, when you put people into categories, some students might be between categories and things like that. So it is tricky. So we're trying to be, a bit broad and generalistic and simplistic here to sort of make a point, I guess. Now, I didn't really do that one very straight. Level 2 is about there. Level 5, yep. Okay. Now we get to level 3 and 4. Obviously, this is where the majority of students will sit as far as their abilities go. So let's say halfway between level 3 and 4, we have 10 students. So that goes right there. And let's say at level 3, we have 8 students. So that goes there. And dead on level 4, we have 8 students as well, dead on there. Okay, now, if you've done any statistics or whatnot before, or you remember back to your high school days, you will know that, I'll just use the same, no I won't, yes. You will remember, or may remember, that this is something of a really badly drawn bell curve. It's called a bell curve. And bell curves do not go like this. Bell curves kind of go like that, and there's a little turn at the top, so they generally go like that. But you get the idea, and it usually comes down at 0. Well, level 0, let's assume level 1 is there, level 0, and then it sort of ends there. Okay, yeah, so now, when you are teaching a class or when you're helping out in a class as a teacher aide, what would be a good colour? Red. Now, purple. Now, when you're helping out in a class, you generally teach to the masses, right? So when you're planning a lesson, you're really planning it to about there, right? Now, this applies whether you're a teacher aide with 3 students and you're helping and you're just changing the curriculum the teacher does, or whether you're teaching a class of 32, or whether you're teaching adults, or whatever you're going about doing, you'll start teaching to here. There's an argument for specific circumstances, but normally you teach to the masses. Certainly in adult education, it's a little different because there are competency requirements that governments or workplaces set and things like that. But generally speaking, even then, the trainers still teach to the average of the class. They do that at university as well. And that's just by the nature of it. If you've got, it's probably more like here, right? So that area there, which covers 6 plus 6 plus 8. So 20 students of, actually that 20 add 6 is 26, add 6 is 32. So that's 32. Wow, that actually worked out how I wanted it to. So of 32 students, you've got 20 there that you're kind of teaching to. So when you're doing your planning, you'd make a single plan to deliver to a class or to a group. But what do you do with these other students here? And even then, what do you do with these ones in here who are slightly different to each other, to the left and to the right? And that's where differentiation comes into its own. Because what's going to happen from a behaviour management, a motivation, a self-esteem, or even just a learning point of view, what's going to happen to these students here at level 1? Well, from a behaviour management point of view, they're not going to be happy. They're not going to be trying to engage in content that it's at level 4. They might do it for 10 minutes at the start of the lesson. These students are usually pretty good at faking doing work, at pretending to do work. They might have a go. Their work is usually very messy. And after a little bit, they'll get overly frustrated, find a reason to get kicked out of class, and so on. So without differentiation, you're going to have a massive amount of behavioural issues from these students here. Normally students who are scoring here, say level 4, you generally don't have behavioural issues with those students. So there's something to say about that, the way in which and the level at which you're delivering your curriculum and how that causes frustration and how that improves motivation, because these students are hitting goals all the time. Please watch my goal setting videos. They're very important. If you're going to do anything in education, watch that goal setting video. So have a think about that, why those students there don't misbehave and why these 3 do. And bearing in mind as well that if you've worked in education for a long time, you will know that students go from one class and they're perfectly little angels and then they're just crazy nutbags in another one. And that's because of this bell curve, by and large. It's also got to do with the way the teacher conducts themselves and things like that. But generally, it's got to do with that bell curve. This happens to adults as well. So if you're here as an adult and you're trying to learn something, even if this is confusing you and you think you're sitting here, you're learning about education, or let's say the example I like to use is if you're putting together furniture. Let's say you're here as far as your abilities and the difficulty level is here. How is that going to make you feel? You're going to be on the phone, calling up the person that you bought the flat pack furniture from, abusing them, blaming the instructions, saying things like, the instructions are all wrong, this is the stupidest thing, I'm never going to buy something from this place anymore. Students do exactly the same thing. They get frustrated, they get annoyed, they get in those escalating battles with the teachers and teacher aides in the class. So what you really want, what differentiation does, is it takes that square there that says, right, this is the lesson and this is where the lesson is aimed at. So the lesson, what would be the right term for that? Direction? Probably not. Anyway, so that's the difficulty level of where the lesson is, I guess, provided at for the masses type of thing. Now, you want to just move that across and move it that way as well, so that almost like there is a separate lesson for these students at the very end. So I'll just draw that in black. So you've got one lesson there. And I guess you could visualize this and think of it as a lesson plan, right? Probably more, actually I've got a better term for that. Let's not call that lesson plan. Yeah, let's call that activity plan. Okay, so you've got activity plan, yeah, let's call that the lesson plan. That might make a little bit more sense now. So we have a lesson plan with the general goal or its general aims, and it's to help students who are at this particular ability to improve in some way. So if we were to do a lesson plan on, say, the multiplications table, we would say, right, we have to make assumptions about where our students are up to. So if we were doing a lesson plan on the multiplication table, how are we going to do a lesson with, say, 25 kids if some kids don't only know the 1 and 2 times table? Some know the 3, some know the 4, some know the 5, some know the 6, and some know every single one of them, including more than what you probably know. So in that case, we generally aim our lesson as far as ability-wise to around that sort of level there. Now, we may do a little bit of revision here quite quickly, but we have to have a general assumption about where students are at. We can't teach our lesson to this level because then these 20 students here, or whatever it is, 22 students, I think, are not going to get much out of the lesson. They're going to get really bored. These students here are going to get real crabby because they're the ones that are used to hitting goals and getting better, and they really want to achieve and they want to, go on and get into different programs or whatever. So they're not going to be happy if you aim your lesson at around this sort of level. You're doing them a huge disservice. But the same applies if your level is aimed here and here. So a simplistic way to think of differentiation is that you need to hit the needs of all of these students. So we'll do a little bit of revision. Our main lesson plan and the goals that we're aiming is for those level 3 and 4, but we've also got some other activities for the level 5 and level 6 students, some extension activities or whatever. Now generally these, in this typical example, these students here might get past this and do the same activities that these students do in 5 minutes, just as a bit of revision, and then they can move on to their own sort of work. So one way to think of this is that you're going to do one lesson plan, whether that's in your head or you're writing it down on paper or whatever, one lesson plan that is made for the masses type of thing, typical lesson plan for a class or your group or whatever. And then you'll either have an activity plan. Now that could be at the bottom of your lesson plan. You could even have a section called differentiation or reasonable adjustments is another term that you see in the adult sector quite often. There's probably other terms. So anyway, you could have a separate little activity plan for these students. Doesn't have to be as big as the lesson plan, but at least you've got some type of adjustments that are going on here, or some type of amendment or change that's happening to that lesson plan. So another way to think of it is lesson plan 1, lesson plan 2, lesson plan 3. That's another way to think about it. Okay, but in reality, what actually happens is you will have a plan, but it's not actually a written plan. You'll only have one written plan. If you're doing teaching at uni or whatever, you'll know that lesson plans, you have to do these big long lesson plans to show that you can see where the lesson links to the curriculum and what the goals are and the learning outcomes and how your activities and strategies all sort of merge together. You will be aiming at this point here, right, directly in the middle. And you may have some activities and some leeway either side of that sort of line. I'm sure there's a name for that line. It's probably the mode line, would it be? I think so. Anyway, so that's the sort of, is that the average? What type of average would that be? Mode. I think it's the mode line. Anyway, so you would aim your lesson plan at that line and you'll put some little adjustments either side. Now, the easiest adjustments to make there is time. So you're just adding in time or other scaffolds, some revisions as we were talking about before. Pace and time is one thing that you could, pace, time, and chunking, which is where you divide things down into little sections. They're probably the 3 or so ways in which you can most easily do differentiation within that band, right? But these bands get a bit too far out, so it becomes really difficult to differentiate all the way out here when you've got 32 students to deal with in a 60-minute lesson. So you do have to somehow come up with a way of doing that, but it is very, very, I wouldn't say difficult, but it does take up quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of time. Now, let's just go through a few different ways in which differentiation can occur. So we've already spoken about a couple. So we've got pace / time. So pace and time, watch my videos on explicit instruction because that is based on pace. It's based on pace really. Pace is a very important part of explicit instruction, pace and momentum. So you can adjust the time so you've got 5 minutes to do an activity, for example, and the speed in which you get through those activities. Instead of getting 3 maths questions done, you might get 2. Obviously, you can adjust the curriculum. And by curriculum, I don't mean the government set curriculum, because obviously you can't adjust that, but you can adjust your curriculum as in your lesson plan. So you can make slight adjustments to that, either, as we were saying before, either formally, which is not a bad idea, or you can put in, you could just make it sort of in your head as you go. So I'm just going to write formal and on the fly. Now, just a quick note about on the fly. You will do on the fly adjustments for every single class, even when you're not doing differentiation, because that's just what education is all about. Regardless of whether you're doing more modern, hip sort of strategies like constructivism or you're doing more old school traditional approaches like explicit instruction, you will, or even sort of didactic instruction, which is about lecturing, you will still always do differentiation because you're adjusting various different aspects of your delivery and you're based on feedback that you get from students and feedback that you observe and so forth. So sometimes you'll have... The other thing that I'll point out as well is that you might differentiate between classes. So you'll have a lesson plan. Let's say you have 4 Year 9 classes doing, say they're learning a second language. You might have one lesson plan for all 4 classes, but you'll make slight tweaks and adjustments, usually in your own mind, for each class. And quite often schools will have bands or something like that where they'll have, I don't know, say a level 1, 2, 3 class. And even if they don't, you can kind of tell when you're teaching that this class is purposely the better students, and this class is the not quite better students, but above average. This is the average, and this is the class that needs a lot of extra help. So in that case, again, you're not differentiating into the same class, you're differentiating across groups of students who are studying the exact same thing straight after each other, but they've been scheduled to be in, one's in class 9A, one's in class 9B. Okay, so yeah, your curriculum, quite often you'll do that formally. And what I do with my lesson plans is if I do write down what I'm, and do a formal lesson plan, or I guess it depends on your definition of formal lesson plan, but there's nothing wrong with just doing some dot points in there where you just to remind yourself about the ways in which you're going to make little changes to your activities so that you try and engage all of these different students along the way. Now, having a special little activity or way in which these students can go about engaging in that lesson, challenge activities, that kind of stuff, will really make these students here feel quite good because, and the reason is that they will know that they're on something of a special plan, I guess you could say. They would know that they're going beyond the norm, and they'll feel that sense of success and public acknowledgement from being able to go through that lesson and through that curriculum at a level that is above what they're expected to do. So positive feedback there. Some materials and marking or whatever, some comments that they can take home, some work samples that you can hang around the room and that you can take home or they can take home to show parents and guardians and things like that. So that's an easy way to deal with the top end. The top end you can deal with quite easily by just adding in sort of additional activities. Now, how would you go about doing that? It doesn't even have to be additional, actually. It just can be amended. So that's number 4. Sorry, I know you can't see. Amended activities. Now, by amended activities, when you start your lesson, so you're going through at the very start and you're saying, right, this is what I want you to do. This is what I want everyone to do. Here are my 10 questions. You could easily just write 3 or 4 extra ones on the board for those students who want that bit of extra challenge. They can go and do those 10, and then they can do the extra 3 or 4. That's the simplistic way to do it. You might have a slightly different worksheet, or you could simply, if let's say you were doing some worksheets or something, you could hand out students to each of those worksheets and just make them do a slightly different question. So you might change a few numbers on there or whatnot. So tiny little adjustments is generally all it takes. I would still, personally, I would get these students here to do what these students in the middle are doing first as a revision type thing, noting that they will do it quicker, and then get them to go on and do other stuff. And that's just a conversation that you have with those students as they come in the class. It can be a bit of a negotiation. It can be a once a week thing where you just have a 2-minute chat to them, a 30-second chat. Grabbing them as they walk in is usually a good way to do that, and just setting that expectation that even though they'll get all of this done, that you expect them to move on and to study at a higher level. Now, for simple things like reading, I mean, this is easy because if you just get rid of science and you just say reading, students pull out their silent reading or they're reading through at their various different levels. Well, level 1 can just read at level 1. Level 2, you choose a level 2 book. So they've just got books that are just, or short stories or whatever they're doing that is just at a slightly different level. So some subjects are very easy to differentiate, particularly when students go off and start working individually or in pairs or whatnot. So these are just a few different ways. Number 5 is set various assessment tasks. So for high school in particular, if you're doing projects or students are let's say they have to do a speech, you could allow students, actually probably a better way to say that would be choice. So you're providing choice. And that way you might get students in a science class here who are particularly interested in something, and then they can run with that. They may be really interested in, say, physics or something. They can run with that, whereas these students down here might be doing something more along the lines, they might be doing science/IT type of task. So again, whatever takes their interest, and that's another one that I need to put up. So interests is another very important aspect to consider, particularly for students who are off task, because giving them something that they're interested in is always going to help, but also particularly, well, for all students really, but that's going to help reduce behavioural issues. And with these students up here, it's going to motivate them even further, because if they're motivated, well, keep them motivated, because you don't want their motivation to drop, because that's just going to, well, it's bad practice, but it's also just going to cause problems for everybody. Now, that's on a whole of class kind of basis. And also just remember that all those teaching strategies, differentiation also applies to behaviour management strategies, although when you go through and watch those behaviour management videos, just basically be aware that all of behaviour management is about differentiation, because the same with behaviour management. You have students who behave at different levels. Some are fantastic, some you have problems with all the time and are repeat offenders. Actually, it's probably the other way around. So level 6, as in students who, let's say you have problems with 6 times a day, as opposed to students who you have problems with never. And it kind of, probably works like that. They're very, very similar. So you have that 1 or 2 students who are just a real pain that cause a lot of issues. So for those ones, differentiation from a behaviour management point of view is very obvious, because you're treating students in a very different way. And as bad as that sounds, that's just how behaviour management works, because students behave and react to things in different ways. So, and that also gets built into your systems. Just like you have systems here for your curriculum and you have planning and whatnot, when you do your behaviour management stuff, you develop systems, and as a part of those systems, you're thinking through the different types of students and the type of personalities, so that you can approach those students and deal with those issues in ways that maximise the chance of your behaviour management strategies and techniques being effective. Okay, so just off the top of my head then, I won't talk about behaviour management anymore, because we're mainly talking about differentiation in terms of teaching strategies. Now, probably one of the most important ones, which I'm running out of room, is resources. I don't think I really need to talk about that one too much, but obviously, particularly when you're working with students with disabilities, if you're going to develop different lessons for different students, different activities or adjusted activities for different students, then you're probably going to need different resources. By resources, I mean, if you're teaching students who are hearing impaired, then they're not going to be, well, they might struggle to watch a movie, for example. But if you're teaching students who, or do internet research, they'll need to use certain assistive technologies to help them. So they're known as, well, we'll classify all those assistive technologies as resources, but teacher aides in particular spend a lot of time developing resources for their students that they're in charge of. So that can be cue cards, or it can be various different ways and scaffolds to help them interact in this lesson. Because a student with a disability, I'm just being very general here, quite often will fit, say, around there. Not always. Sometimes, of course, you get people that fit wherever, but quite often those students with disabilities, if they're in a general class, they're usually slightly, say at level 2, depending on the disability and the disorder. Obviously, if it's only a physical disability, they're in a wheelchair or something, that's not going to have any difference. I suppose I'm talking more so about, when I talk about disabilities, I'm mainly talking about autism and those neurological issues, and the types of students that you get in special needs schools or special schools or education support centres. They go by various different names. So probably not disabilities, I'm probably talking more like disorders. But again, when people say disabilities, they usually mean disorders. There is a slight difference between the two. Disorders is usually of the brain, like neurological type of thing, learning disorders, social disorders, autism, that kind of stuff, whereas disabilities are usually more physical. And of course, the other type is, I'm going to write this upside down just to make it fun for you guys, difficulties. So they're the three different ones. Difficulties is usually just temporary. And bearing in mind a lot of the research and statistics that clearly shows that students who usually have a disorder, I think about 60% of the time they have two, or they have difficulties that come with it as well. I think it's, off the top of my head, I haven't read this for a long time, but I think it's something like 68%, 60%, something like that, of people with autism have a second disability or a disorder of some description. And that can be just something minor like hearing or whatnot, but or it can be something a bit more impactful, or as far as impacting on their learning. So just off, let's use a different pen just for the hell of it, because we're getting sick of that colour. So let's look at some teaching strategies. Obviously scaffolding and chunking, they're the first two that come to mind, and deliberate practice. Okay, so scaffolding and chunking. Scaffolds is a way of developing resources and activities which help a student achieve a learning goal. So watch my videos on scaffolding because it's difficult to explain in 10 seconds, but again, relatively simple concepts. Obviously, changing things around for students who need extra help in one way or another is going to involve scaffolding. Chunking is a way of dividing things up. So if you have a particular problem, let's say I usually just draw a square to represent chunking, then, and let's say you're studying history, then you can just divide that problem into 4. But then you could also divide that into 4 and that into 4 and so on and so forth. So that's the basics of chunking. Another way to describe chunking is you can divide a maths question into 6 steps. But if you really look at it closely, you could potentially divide a maths question into 20 steps, 2 steps, 4 steps, whatever. So you divide problems and processes down in various different ways depending on the student. Deliberate practice. So that's where you're just doing a particular activity with the view to improving one or more aspects of your skills or knowledge over and over and over again. So you might just practice the 6 times tables non-stop for 6 minutes or something like that. So that's deliberate practice, quite often used in sport and art and more with gross motor and fine motor skills, but it does apply across the board. Now your metacognitive skills, I'm not even going to explain that one. Well, I will actually. Thinking about thinking, that's how I define it and most people define it, particularly for these students. But it also applies across here. But there are lots of different types of metacognitive skills. But if you want students to really, really learn how to learn and learn how to achieve and to be successful, it's all that metacognitive skills. Something that I push all the time and that unfortunately it's just not taught anywhere. I don't know the last time I ever saw a PD or a course besides ours that involved metacognitive skills. And I think it's one of the most important teaching strategies that once you start learning about it, whether you're a teacher aide or teacher or whatever, you'll just use that to absolute death. And one of the most important parts of that is concept understanding as opposed to task completion. Completing a task is purposeless. It's a waste of time. Generally speaking, having students complete 10 maths questions, who cares? If they don't understand the concepts behind it and they can't do it again the next day, it doesn't matter. You're better off having them finish 1 question or 2 questions, but have them understand the maths behind it and the processes behind it and the reason why you do this and do that and so forth. So that's called concept understanding as opposed to task completion. Yeah, so that's one sort of metacognitive skill. And part of that is proceduralizing. I'm going to write this really messy. Proceduralizing. So that basically means you're teaching kids to take difficult things to turn it into a procedure so that they can then replicate that procedure in other contexts. So that's metacognitive skills. Let's do another one. Active reading. Let's do active reading. So active reading is one of the literacy type strategies. So have you ever read something and then thought, I didn't remember a single word of that? Like you read a page in a novel or whatever. That's because you're not active reading, you're passive reading. Active reading is when you're reading specifically to find certain types of information inside the text. So if you can direct students to be looking for certain things while they're reading, then they'll remember those things. If you tell students just to read this page, they'll get to the end and they won't have a clue. But if you do some type of active reading task around it, again, watch those videos on that. Very important to know active reading. If you don't know active reading, you're teaching high school or anyone above year 3 or 4 how to read, then yeah, there's problems. So anyway, there's hundreds of those. I would watch some of the other videos in this book here, the teaching strategies. Technically there's 100, but in actual fact, 101, but in actual fact, there's probably about 150 in there. And I don't know if you can see that, but I just go through and list every single one. Motivation strategies, learning by teaching, massed practice, cross-curricular learning, micro-learning, teaching aids and props, brainstorming. So there's a never-ending number of them. I think scaffolding, chunking are really two very important ones. Metacognitive skills is another really important one. The other one that comes to mind is questioning techniques, and I think we'll finish on that one. Questioning techniques is one of the main areas where teachers are able to differentiate. Now, I said in another video not long ago, a couple of days ago, that teachers ask about 400 questions per day, says the research. So there is some research out that says teachers ask around about 400 questions a day, thereabouts. Now, that's for teachers that are on class, probably middle school. I can't remember what age it was or where they were teaching specifically, but and that probably sounds about right to me. There is a really good high-performing, experienced teachers are constantly asking questions. We call that opportunities to respond, and in doing that, you can ask. Let's say you're talking to students about, well, let's say we're reading something. You're talking to students about a reading passage. Now, you can ask this student, after you've read a passage of a short story to them, you can ask students at that level a simple question like, what is the name of the main character? You can ask questions of these students that are probably slightly more difficult, right up until the end here, where you can ask students about, what do you think the author is trying to say about society or about changes in society or whatever. So you can move the level of questions across and direct different questions to different students so that all students have those opportunities to respond. And of course, along with that research was the obvious finding, and something that educational researchers have known since about the 60s, and that's that the more opportunities to respond and the more engaged students are, the more that they can remember and recollect further in the future, so say 2 weeks later or whatever, and the better concept understanding they have as well. I've got a video on questioning techniques, so please watch that, because it may seem simple to ask questions, but there's a lot of minute best practice aspects to questioning when it comes to working as a teacher or a teacher aide or other educational professional that is worth spending the time learning, because it does help. And that is what I've got to say about differentiation. Thank you for watching.